This is the 2018 Sloan Analytics Conference, and we're really excited to have Johnny Sun. He's actually a PhD, third-year PhD student at MIT. He's on Twitter at Johnny Sun, and he'll be talking about, his topic is called Help Them Be Heard, Creative and Authentic Approaches for Fan Engagement and Experience. So let's welcome Johnny to the stage.
Hey everyone, thanks for coming. I'm sure we'll get out of here on time to catch Obama. But first, me, I guess. My name is Johnny Sun. I'm a social media creative, primarily on Twitter, where I have over 500,000 followers accrued to my personal account. And I'm also a PhD student at MIT and a creative researcher at Harvard. And so I wanted just to give a bit of context about who I am and to talk about the perspectives that I'm going to be speaking from. I'm an artist, an architect, an engineer, an urban designer, a playwright, a comedian both on stage and online, where again, this is my Twitter account with over 500,000 followers, and an author. This is a book that I put out last summer. And so that's kind of the perspective I'm coming from a creative perspective, probably from one that is a bit rare for this conference, but I wanted to share some of my experiences. I've previously been in the New York Times, and just last summer, I was named one of the 25 most influential people on the internet. So that's kind of my perspective into this. Now, I wanted to give you 3 case studies and 3 essentially provocations about the work that I've done and how that can apply potentially to the sports field and the industry. The first one is about discovering stories. The second one is about understanding how people engage with you. And the third one is about creating unique experiences. So in terms of discovering stories, I wanted to talk a bit about my architecture work. This was a publication that I published a few years ago called Gaming Urbanism, which the idea was to essentially look at video game narratives and look at how people experience spaces through video games and try to apply that to physical spaces and to the city. And so the kind of analogy for your field would be to be looking at sports stadiums and looking at fan villages and looking at how people can experience those physical environments and physical experiences through narratives and through these storytelling methods. So if you look to this map, this is actually a video game map that shows levels and connections and the ways that people get to places. You compare that to a map of Boston, which doesn't look like that, which looks more like a field, which looks more like the way a normal map would. But say we put those two together and say we line them up and try to make the map on the left look a little bit more like the map on the right. And we can do that by taking away the elements that most people don't experience of the city on their day-to-day life. So as we start to cut away those points and we start to only look at landmarks and look at paths that people take to get between points of interest, you can start to see how the map of Boston starts to look a bit like the map of a video game. Zooming in on that, I've isolated a few that my team did a few years ago, the first being the map that a traveler or a conference goer would take, for example. So you would arrive at the airport, perhaps stay at a hotel somewhere downtown or in the Back Bay area, and then travel to the conference center. And essentially, this would be the map of your experience of Boston. This would be your narrative. These would be the 3 points of interest that you travel across. You could compare that in a different way to a resident of Boston, for example. So a teenager who would live in South Boston may grow up in a neighborhood down South Boston, may go to a school nearby a few blocks down, and then on the weekends may, again, travel to Back Bay and do some shopping and do some hanging out in the social areas. So those are ways that you can create narratives out of these physical spaces. I applied that study to a fellowship in Rome, where I went to study how people experience a specific neighborhood in the city. And this was my study. I essentially walked around and wandered through the city and mapped my own experience as I walked through and meandered and found different landmarks and found different points of interest in a way to understand how people experience physical spaces. So as you see, this was kind of my experience walking through the city. I'd start in one corner and I'd follow a path. I'd hit an interesting church or something, and that would cause me to switch directions, to turn around, to follow another path down. And then in this way, I started to uncover different elements of the city and different points of interest, and I created my own mental map. I created my own story that I would tell about my experiences through the city. And through that way, we can uncover certain points and certain points of interest and get this fuller map of my environment. And I use this as a comparison and a talking point because I'd like to provoke you to think about how your fans move through your experiences and how they move through your stadiums, how they move through fan villages, how they move through not only just the place where the game takes place, but the urban context around it. And in studying the ways that they map out these certain landmarks and these stories, you can create better stories and more interesting experiences, both getting to the game and leaving the game as well. And I also applied this theory to the design of a neighborhood in Boston and traced out these sorts of narratives and these stories for people to experience. So again, in the Discover Stories section, you can ask yourself, how do your fans move through stadiums and fan villages? What types of stories emerge? Where do they get interested? Where do they get excited? Where do they bump into other people? Where do they get lost or confused? And then take all that sort of qualitative content-based data about their mental maps and about their stories and experiences that happen, and how can you use that to design more memorable experiences and stories through physical space. Now, the second case I'm going to talk about is understanding how people engage with you. And I'm going to shift gears from the physical and talk about the social media side and talk about social media engagement. So this is a study that I published last year called Responses to Viral Bullshit. And essentially what that was a study of fake facts and misinformation online, and looking at how people responded to a fake fact over time. So this is actually something that I tweeted out from my personal account to my audience. And the only context you need to know is you need to know who Will Smith is. How many of you know who Will Smith is? And you need to know about his family. So Will Smith is married to Jada Smith, and they have two kids named Willow Smith and Jaden Smith. Now, I tweeted out these two screenshots from a Google search that asked for Will Smith's middle name and Jada Smith's middle name, and it returned Will Oliver Smith and Jada Naomi Smith. So if you put that middle initial with their first name, it's Will O. Smith and Jada N. Smith, implying that they named their kids Willow and Jaden after their names and their middle initials. Does that make sense? Okay, so the thing about that thing is that it's actually a fake fact. I doctored that image. Their middle names aren't Oliver or Naomi. Their middle names are Christopher and Corin. And so this fact that I tweeted out turned out to be misinformation, intentional misinformation done to sort of study how people would respond to a fake fact. This tweet went viral. It hit over 50,000 likes in the first week, got 5 million engagements, and kind of has continued to spread. And so what I did was I took that tweet and I mapped out the responses. And I found that there were 4 different waves of responses from an audience and from the ways that they engage with this tweet. The first is that people said, I can't believe this is real. They were blown away by this fact. They said things like, oh my God, this changes everything. My brain just exploded. All these people who accepted this fake fact as true. The second wave were people who rightfully saw that this was a fake fact. They did their own Google searches, and they started to fight back against this viral piece of misinformation. The third wave was when it started to get interesting because people started to say, oh, I already knew this fact. And they started to say things like, everybody already knew about this. This was so obvious. Why are people just realizing this? So they claimed to know that this fact was true before I made it up. And the fourth wave, of course, was people who saw this thing go viral and just didn't understand what the connotation was. So there was a wave of people who stated that they didn't get it. Now, in my study, that was about 4,000, 5,000 tweets in the first little bit. And so I collated them and I categorized them by content. I categorized them in those 4 waves. The affirm wave, which is people who believed it was true. The deny wave, which people believed, who knew it was false. The over-affirm, which was people who, again, thought that they had known this forever, and then the confusion class of people who didn't get it. And now, collating this data, we found that an overwhelming amount of people just believed it straight up, so 82% of the responses were people who believed it. And then the smaller categories were people who said it was fake, they already knew it, I don't get it, and then a very small percentage of people just said, fuck you. And abuse, and had like the abusive harassment speech that you always get on Twitter. We mapped out this this response over the first 24 hours, and you see a jump when the fact goes viral in the first place. And then once it hits the morning, about 6 a.m., engagement kind of dies down. And it starts to spike just about midday. And that actually happens because it starts to pick up external news and external media and different headlines, and so that gives it a second life. In terms of mapping, we also mapped out the responses as percentages. So these were the types of responses over the first week. And as you can see, the black represents the percentage of people who responded who believed this tweet. So overwhelmingly, the black kind of area represents people who bought into it. Now, there are 4 different trends here, the first being that there was an initial wave after the tweet went viral that people tried to fact correct, who tried to say this was fake, who tried to warn people that this was a piece of misinformation. The second phase that happened right after that were the people who saw the viral tweet, and in response to this first wave of people saying this was fake, were people who fought back and were saying, no, this isn't, I already knew this for years and years. And then the next wave would be people who responded with confusion and who didn't get it. And finally, after all this sort of discourse dies down, we're left at this point on the last day of this week where 100% of the people responding to the tweet, again, were people who believed it. So that sort of is the neutral state of this piece of misinformation. This happens again in the second week, where again we see similar trends, or we see this leading wave of people saying that this is fake. And then this trailing wave of these 2 different responses of confusion and of people who think that they already knew it. Again, once this discourse dies down, we get to a point where everyone continues to respond that they believe it. So in using this sort of study and in looking at how people respond to Twitter in terms of the content and the ways that people are talking about things, I wanted to create that as a provocation for how you may use social media and analytics to understand how people engage with you. How do fans react to key events on social media? How do they react to wins, to losses, to trades, to different season, key points in different seasons? And out of that, not only looking at the numbers, but looking at the context and the content, the qualitative information, what trends emerge, how do people respond, how are they talking about these things, and how can you categorize them? And once you find those patterns that are specific to your teams, how can you respond to your fans in more specific and informed ways? Now this third category and this third case that I want to talk about is a bit of a fun one. This one is about Twitter as well, but can be applied to sort of any social media experience or any sort of social media team that you want to talk about. And this is about a bot that I made called Tiny Care Bot. A bot is on Twitter an automated sort of account that will tweet hourly or daily or however you want it to tweet. And this bot tweets self-care reminders. So this bot says things like, don't forget to take a second to spend a bit of time outside if you can, or stay hydrated, or take a bit of time to respond to messages from your friends. And I made this bot because I thought that I recognized that self-care was a hot topic on Twitter and something that people needed more of. And so I created this bot to take the pressure off of myself to remind people to take care of themselves, and to create this so that this could automatically remind people to do that. Now, the benefit of having a bot do this instead of a person is that the bot will always reply. So I set it up so that whenever anybody tweets at the bot will respond with a personal reminder. And the other thing is the bot is always there. It's always on because it's an automated process. It can respond and engage with fans and with audience members and with people, potentially in ways that are more exciting and more present than any one person or any social media team can. And out of this, the bot became popular. It has over 100,000 followers on Twitter right now. And there's this little community that's gathered around it. And people started reporting about this bot as well. So out of this sort of automated process, you can create these communities and these crowds of people that will engage with this specific topic. So again, to provoke you in how this can apply to your industry in the field of sports, I'd kind of think about how you can expand your online presence. Think about how you can use social media and the strengths of social media to talk about to be more present and to have different elements of discourse applied to your fans and your audiences. The other thing is what bots would fans engage with? What different ways could you think of applying a bot like TinyCareBot to a sports context? And thirdly, how do you create a sense of play and participation online? Like, that's the name of the game, is to create communities and to engage fans in fun ways and new ways and things that they've never seen before. So once again, my 3 cases were to discover stories by seeing how people engage with spaces, to understand how people engage with you by mapping out quantified conversations, and to create unique experiences using the strengths of social media. And I'll end a bit early so we can have time for questions. Thank you. Do we have any questions? Yes, in the back.
So if you're the group that's actually creating events and designing the space, how can you sort of weaponize this data from the creation standpoint? It's not a fixed venue. It's a music festival. It's a
Sure.
festival. And beyond some simple foot traffic analysis, how might you use some things you've been doing
Yeah.
to amplify the experience?
Yeah, well, I would look at, I'd try and define case studies and try to start by gathering data in similar events and similar sorts of types of things that you want to do, and apply that to the event that you're creating. And I think the benefit of talking to people as they're going through this and sort of gathering the data as the event is going on is that you can make sort of a feedback loop. So it's not just applying this data or studying it after the event happens, but you can do this in real time and start to shift and start to understand the experience as it's happening, so you can respond in real time and start to shape experiences based on how other people are already experiencing the event.
Introducing social for that dynamic feedback during the event.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, introducing social, or even the first sort of case that I talked about with architectural experience and physical experience, looking at how people are moving through spaces and taking that chance to shift the ways that your festivals are organized or oriented in order to create more meaningful experiences. Yes, in the back.
So in the bot piece, right, like each tweet has to come from somewhere. So is there like a mini content plan that you kind of have set that's like kind of curated from that? And then how do you take in all these responses? Like text would be an unlimited amount of responses.
Right.
How do you like kind of respond accurately from that?
Sure. So the first part of that question, the source of the content, that is all created and that is all programmed. I didn't have to program like all the different millions of combinations that I would say, but I did have to program an algorithm that would take different elements and sort of package them into different pieces. And so I did that in about an hour, and it can create hundreds and thousands of different types of tweets. And so that's just a programming challenge, and that's an algorithmic thing. In terms of responses, it's the same thing. There are ways that you can read the responses from people on Twitter, and based on the content that they send to you, you can respond in certain ways. My bot hasn't done that. My bot's just set up to randomly respond with like a new tweet, but it is possible very easily to take in something that they say and then respond in context to what they're talking about. So, yeah. Other questions? Yes, over here.
So the big facts on Twitter have reaction. Have you tried it with any other, tried analyzing those kinds of trends, perhaps with other tweets, perhaps just sort of president tweets? You see similar reactions across the
Right. So the question was, has this sort of analysis been applied, the Twitter analysis been applied to other types of tweets and other fields? And I'd say yes, there's a whole, I haven't done any personally, but there is a whole sort of field of study that looks at the ways that people respond to different sorts of tweets. And a lot of that now is based on misinformation and of rumors and of fact-checking, because that's kind of what's happening in our social media ecosystem right now. Yeah, they do. It turns out that those 4 categories, the sort of affirm, deny, over-affirm, and confusion, those are similar, and those sort of play out in similar ways across all sorts of different rumors and different fact-checking studies that have happened. And so the disheartening part of that is that most people will always believe the fake fact, even if it doesn't even if it's not true. So, other questions? Yes.
So with the misinformation, I know you analyze people's kind of immediate responses, but did you do any work around how spreading misinformation impacted people's ongoing perception?
Yeah, well, so this was a funny case because I outed myself as creating this fake fact, and so people sort of saw me as someone who's in on the joke in a sense. But that definitely did change the ways that people responded. When I started telling them that this was a fake fact that I tweeted to see what would happen, people started responding with more and more overblown sorts of responses, like sarcastic or totally exaggerated types of responses. The thing is, though, that this tweet sort of takes on a life outside of me, and years later, actually, it started to pick up again for some reason, and it started to go viral again, and it started to exhibit the same sorts of trends and traits in terms of the responses that had nothing to do with me. And this tweet, because of the way Twitter works, it's been stolen by other people, it's been posted by other accounts, and looking at those responses, you get the same sorts of trends every time. So, yes?
For your categories of responses, did you start your study trying to map responses to those categories, or did you discover those categories as a result of your study?
So I discovered the categories as a result of my study. So what I did was I actually hand-coded all the tweets. So that was about 5,000 responses in the first few weeks. And so I went through those, and I started creating categories based on the content from there. And so eventually I ended up with those 4 or 5 categories, if you include the hate speech part of it. But that came inductively, and that came out of the process of looking at everything. So. And I would wager that looking at different sorts of responses online, you can start to categorize different, like fan responses, for example, or different types of responses to different events. So, cool. Any other questions? All right, thank you. Let's go watch the president talk.